Okay, you might have noticed that I put 2 whole chapters in there for a reading, and I'm not going to read 2 whole chapters, don't worry. But as I've spoken before, sometimes it's hard to divide things down into small chunks and still have them make any sense. And so what we have here in Judges, once again, a book we probably don't look at super often, is that that first reading, chapter 4, is the story of Deborah and Barak. And then chapter 5 is a song about that story. And originally, I figured I would go through the story, because it's probably not one super familiar to everyone. I'm sure most people probably heard it at some point, but it's not one that gets talked about a lot. But then as I started preparing my sermon, I realized what I really wanted to talk about was the song in 5, and so it's the same story, it's just done as a song about the event rather than a prose telling of the event itself. And I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but I'm going to go through a chunk of the beginning and a chunk of the end, and I'm pretty sure you'll be able to put it together from there. And then we'll go over why I'm so incredibly excited to talk about this, because I brought my watch to make sure I didn't go radically over time. You'll find out. So I'm going to start by reading through this, and then I will confuse you all for far too long. All right. So I'm going to actually read 5, the song, about the story from the preceding chapter. Read the story when you get a chance. It's interesting, at the very least. Then Deborah and Barak, son of Abinoam, sang on that day, saying, "When locks are long in Israel, when the people offer themselves willingly, bless the Lord. Hear, O kings, give ear, O princes. To the Lord I will sing. I will make melody to the Lord, the God of Israel. Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled, and the heavens poured. The clouds indeed poured water. The mountains quaked before the Lord, the one of Sinai, before the Lord, the God of Israel. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, caravans ceased, and travelers kept to the byways. The peasantry prospered in Israel. They grew fat on plunder, because you arose, Deborah, arose as a mother in Israel. When new gods were chosen, then war was in the gates. Was shield or spear to be seen among 40,000 in Israel? My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel, who offered themselves willingly among the people. Bless the Lord." And I am going to skip towards the end and go to verse 24. "Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, of tent-dwelling women most blessed. He asked water, and she gave him milk. And she brought him curds in a lordly bowl. She put her hand to the tent peg, and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera a blow. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. He sank, he fell, he lay still at her feet. At her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. Out of the window she peered. The mother of Sisera gazed through the lattice. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarry the hoofbeats of his chariots? Her wisest ladies make answer. Indeed, the answer's the question herself. Are they not finding the dividing the spoil? A girl or two for every man, spoil of dyed stuffs for Sisera, spoil of dyed stuffs embroidered, 2 pieces of dyed work embroidered for my neck as a spoil. So perish all your enemies, O Lord, but may your friends be like the sun as it rises in its might. And the land had rest for 40 years. Little gruesome. But believe it or not, there's a lot of that in here. So, to tell the story of Deborah and Barak, Deborah who rises up as a judge, Barak the general who helps lead the army, they crush a Canaanite army that is oppressing them from Hatzor, just on the north side of Israel, just above the Sea of Galilee, not that far. They go out, they crush this army. The leader, Sisera, runs off, and he tries to hide in the tent of this woman named Jael, who feeds him, and when he goes to sleep, she puts a tent peg through his head. The end. That is the real short version of the story. Now, I have a personal connection to this story. When I was being confirmed, one of the confirmation teachers, and he helped lead all the youth stuff at my church, his name was Bob. Awesome guy. Bob had a great sense of humor. He was a lot of fun. But when I was confirmed, he gave me a card, like everyone else, congratulations. And on the bottom, he wrote down a verse. And I'm like, oh, Bob is really insightful. He's really good. I'm curious what verse it was that he thought that I should remember on this day of my confirmation. And he wrote Judges 4:21. But Jael, wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground. He was lying fast asleep from weariness, and he died. And I'm like, Bob, I will remember this forever. So, this is my personal connection. Not all that valuable necessarily for sermon material, other than it's a fun little story. But in order to tell the story of Deborah and Barak and why I'm so excited, I want to start somewhere else completely. Because I think we tend to get really myopic sometimes. We tend to get really focused. And we forget that all of these stories, all of this world that exists in this book is a part of people from a much broader world around them telling their story, right? This doesn't exist in isolation. While the Israelites were going through their kings and fighting their wars, stuff was going on all over the place that impacted a lot of this, that was really relevant and important and meaningful. And so today you're going to get a little bit more academic-y kind of thing, because I want to start by talking about the city of Ugarit. Now, I'm going to bet no one here has ever heard of Ugarit, and that is a shame. That is not to you. It's terrible that this is not a more well-known place, because there's all these ancient cities out there that people have probably heard the names of. People know about Thebes, right, in Egypt. People know about Athens and Sparta, but nobody seems to know about Ugarit. So there is this truly amazing city. It is in what is modern, it is on the coast of the Mediterranean in modern-day Syria. So it's one on that little chunk of land that Syria has in the Mediterranean, just above Lebanon, below Turkey. And Ugarit was a continuously occupied city going all the way back to somewhere around 6,000-ish BCE. This is one of the oldest places in the world that could be called a city. Okay? Over there with like Sumer and Babylon, this place was ancient. And in all of that time, it developed sort of a city-state kind of vibe, right? So there was the main city and a bunch of communities around it that worked together to create this united Ugarit civilization. And it was sort of the definition of a Canaanite civilization in the region. The language of Ugaritic is a North Semitic language, so it's the same root language where we get Hebrew from, and a few other modern languages like Aramaic. But it became, in the Bronze Age, a major trade hub for the entire Mediterranean. And when I say major trade hub, I mean in the ruins of this one ancient city, we have found products coming from Greece, modern Cyprus and Crete, Egypt, Turkey, Lebanon, Israel, Libya, Iraq, Iran, all the way over to Afghanistan. in this little city on the coast of the Mediterranean. They were the hub by which most of the other civilizations of the Mediterranean kind of traded their stuff, which made it fun for them because everyone wanted to capture their city. So it traded hands a few times between the various empires trying to stake their claim, but no one ever wanted to destroy it or anything. No one came in and wanted to conquer it. They wanted to own it so they could benefit from it. So despite being conquered again and again and again, they were left intact every time. And it was just sort of you're going to pay some of your taxes to us, and we get some benefits from your ports, and otherwise you can do your thing because you're awesome. That was Ugarit. Okay. Ugarit invented some really important things in their time, which you can do when you are a relatively stable major city and civilization for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. They introduced the first language that we know of, at least, that is what we call a phonetic language, like us. Older languages tended to use combination sounds, so you didn't have independent letter sounds. It was always 2 to 3 letters combined in a sound. So your alphabets were huge because it wasn't B-A. It was B-A as one letter, and if you needed C-A, that was a different letter, and if you needed D-A, that was a different letter, and it made it complicated. They had a 22-letter alphabet that they could write phonetically in. And the only reason we call it phonetic is because the next civilization to do this is the Phoenicians, who happened to show up just down the coast from Ugarit shortly after Ugarit was destroyed. Isn't that convenient? So, had they not been destroyed, we would all be speaking Ugaritic languages instead of phonetic languages. But they also invented something else that I think is super cool, and I'm going to play a little clip from this. They invented musical notation. And I don't mean just Babylon had come up with musical notation a while before, but it wasn't like all the notes. It was little fragments of things that talked about use this tune and put in this chunk of something. Note by note, pacing, a kind of musical notation that wouldn't be replicated until the medieval period in Europe. And I want to show you or have you listen to just a little bit of a song that is somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,500 years old. It is the oldest intact written song we have ever found. That was temple music from the Hurrian states, which is just out kind of northeast of Ugarit, dating back 3,500 years, and as of right now is the oldest music we have ever discovered. These are the kinds of things that Ugarit, this trade hub city that everybody wanted but nobody wanted to wreck, was able to do. Now, Egypt controlled the territory all the way up to Ugarit for a chunk of time. However, this ended in 1274 BCE when the Hittites, a group in modern Turkey, and another group I could easily talk about for hours, pushed them out and down at the Battle of Kadesh and set the boundary between Egypt and Hattusha, the Hittites, at Kadesh. So when we're reading the Bible, I think it's important we remember that Egypt refers to all of the land from Libya up to Kadesh, which is north of Israel. All of that was Egyptian territory, all the way through until there's some debate on that. It goes back and forth, but well past the point where Israel is established. So at this point, Ugarit is a Hittite vassal city that, once again, they don't do anything to it. They're just, hey, we need some of your troops. We want some tax revenue. You do your thing. As of 1274 BCE. And this is kind of a stable point then at the end of the Bronze Age. After Egypt and the Hittites end their war, nobody really messes with Ugarit for a while. There aren't any major things for a little chunk of time until you get to just before 1200 BCE. And this is where we get into something called the Bronze Age collapse, which I've mentioned before, because this is what makes it possible for places like Israel and Philistine and some of these other groups to develop into stable civilizations. When the Bronze Age collapsed just after 1200 BCE, all of these big players like Egypt and the Hittites and the Assyrians and the Mycenaeans, they all explode. Well, that happened to Ugarit too. For the first time, realistically, Ugarit was not spared destruction. So, just before everything kind of fell apart, just before 1200, you start seeing a lot of problems around the Mediterranean. You start seeing crop failures and famine. There was a notable temperature change around the Mediterranean that made it drier, and starting from the west, starting in the west and moving east. So we start seeing things from what we now would call Italy and Sardinia and those places. Moving westward, you see crop failures and famine and huge numbers of peoples migrating, trying to escape that. Along with that, you get a lot of warfare starting, once again, over in the west, moving eastward, because as people become desperate, they take desperate measures. And finally, to make everything worse, there is an enormous, what is called an earthquake storm that happens around the Mediterranean. There are a number of fault lines in this region, and basically they all get agitated at the same time, and over a span of decades, you get a whole bunch of small-ish earthquakes. Small-ish, still enough to tumble down a bunch of brick buildings, ancient construction. Whole cities where the gates are like twisted at levels. You can see walls that suddenly go like this, because the walls are built on fault lines that they had no idea about, and then as one side drops and the other side pushes up. This wrecked huge cities. One of the major ones in the ancient world, Mycenae, if you've ever read the Iliad or the Odyssey, right? This is where a lot of the Greeks are out of. You can see a wall literally right next to the gate that goes and Mycenae falls right around 1200. The city is destroyed and is no longer inhabited. In 1203, so right in this time period, we have the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah, who, with all this violence, with people moving in, with all this going on, he wages a war against Libya. So he goes westward a little bit there. And then when Libya is dealt with, apparently there was a bunch of uprisings in Canaan, which, remember, at this point is Egypt. So he runs from over here all the way up the coast, and this is where we get the first mention of Israel outside of Scripture, because it talks about the Israelites being one of the groups that he crushes in rebellion, along with a few others. Now, Mycenae falls right around 1200. Troas, which is the edge of Turkey, all of those cities go dark shortly after that. The city of Hattusha, capital of the Hittite Empire, the most powerful civilization in the Mediterranean at the time, collapses and is never rebuilt. Finally, in about 1180, it comes from Ugarit. And we have clay tablets from the city of letters being sent from the ruler of Ugarit out to some of these other places. He sends a letter to Cyprus, this island not far off the coast, right? And I have the actual text of this letter. My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. There's another letter that went along with it shortly thereafter, asking for more backup to fight off these ships. Cyprus, being an island, had a substantial navy to help. Except this is the reply. As for the matter concerning those enemies, it was the people from your own country and your own ships who did this, and it was the people from your country who committed these transgressions. Be aware. As everything's falling apart, Ugarit falls not to an outside army as much as to its own probably starving people. Because in the destruction of Ugarit in 1180, the parts of the city that are destroyed aren't the outside edges where the people lived. It's not the temples. It's not the granaries. It's the noble estates and the civic buildings that house the lords of the city. That is what destroyed Ugarit. Now, in 1178, the 2 years after the destruction of Ugarit, the Bronze Age collapse as a process comes to an end, as an enormous wave of invaders attempts to make their way into Egypt proper, what we now consider Egypt. And the Pharaoh is forced to fight against them, and is the only civilization of the period that survives, that manages to take down this invading. Calling it an army is wrong, because they made carvings showing these battles, right? Showing the people they defeated. And there's people with weapons, people representing civilizations from all around the Mediterranean. And they went in detail to show it. People wearing Greek helmets, people wearing Hittite helmets, all of these people that had been trying to escape destruction ended up on Egypt's doorstep. And they ended up there not as an army, because there's ox carts full of supplies and families and children. This was a wave of people migrating to avoid destruction and starvation. And Egypt wiped them out, ending the Bronze Age collapse. Now, this actually created the Philistines, because one of the groups that Egypt holds on to as captives is a group called the Peleset, which they decide to relocate back up in Canaan and become known as the Philistines, which show up a little later in here. So, why am I bothering going on for this long about this random city up the coast that has nothing to do with the story of Deborah and Barak defeating Canaanites from Hatzor right in Galilee? Okay, I get there. I'm getting there. I promise. Okay? Why am I bothering? Because this song that I read from, chapter 5, is probably, from what we can tell, not originally written in Hebrew. At least not the same Hebrew that the rest of the Old Testament is written in. As far as scholars can tell, it may have been written in the Ugaritic language, which died out very shortly after the city itself was destroyed. Which means that this text, chapter 5, the song, predates the story it's about before. And it may predate, the physical writing of it may predate anything else in here. This may be the oldest piece of text this entire book contains. Because the Hebrew language, as it's known in the rest of this, didn't even exist when Ugaritic died out. This is the oldest story we have in here. And I think that is incredibly amazing. Because now we have to play it, so that places it. Now we know the time frame it has to happen in, right? It happens before 1178, maybe very shortly thereafter, but probably in that neighborhood. This is a story about the collapse, right? This is a bunch of tribes, a bunch of these peoples who have been beaten by the Egyptians, who have been beaten by the Hittites, who have been kept, as they're watching the world around them fall apart, they're finally like, yeah, it's our time now. We're going to do something with it. And Deborah and Barak is the story of these small people, the people that the Egyptians refer to as the Habiru, by the way, which is where we probably get the word Hebrew from. And it roughly translates as riffraff. This is where the Habiru band together and take down the king of Hatzor and his army. Sisera may very well be an Egyptian name, because Sisera doesn't really, it's not, the name doesn't make sense in the language we have, but it could be Sesra, which means servant of Ra, which means instead of Hatzor being an independent Canaanite nation, which is kind of how it's set up, this could very easily be an Egyptian outpost that controlled the territory that the Israelites were finally done with. As they're watching everything else around them get destroyed, this is their time to escape Egyptian control in the territory. And who does it? A woman named Deborah, who unites all of these communities together with a guy named Barak who does what she tells him to do, right? And when they defeat the army and the leader of the army, Sisera, escapes, he runs off to the tent of some other woman named Yael, Yahweh is God, who puts a tent peg through his head and finishes him off. The beginning of our entire tradition, in writing at least, is two women defeating the enemies of the Israelites, this riffraff group of people in a place that was on the verge probably of starvation, who finally said they weren't going to take it anymore. I think that is a really interesting story. And I think knowing the context, knowing what's going on around it, not having it be this random little isolated story that we can frankly pretty easily skip over without any harm to like our faith, about how we live out our lives, all right? It's not some random blip in here. This means something because it's where it all starts. It means something because it is part of this enormous historical trajectory that made Israel possible, that made this book possible. Thank you, Deborah and Jael. We owe you a lot for that. Amen.